The thing on my mind this morning is my emerging opinion that most of the Tantric scriptures, probably from the very beginning, are completely full of crap. And
What?
probably written by phonies who didn't know shit. So,
Which scriptures are you talking about? Like the ones that we've been studying
Yeah.
with
yeah,
Professor Sanderson?
that too.
Like the ones
although-
that our practices are based on?
Well, here's the point that we get to is our practices are not based on that. Any practice is based on experience first, and then the reason we've been combing these texts all these years is to try to find some hints about anything else that might be hidden in there. There might be a few hints, but they are certainly not understood by scholars. For instance, a simple thing, Pinda, Pada, Rupa, and Rupatita. What is that? Well, what they're really talking about is the four stages of the energetic mechanism. Pinda being the lower section, which supports constitution. The Pada being the middle section, which is emotional and informational organization. The third part being, the upper part being intuitive, and the fourth part, being pure space. By the time the Malini Vijayottara is coming about, those people don't know shit, basically. And all of those, endless sadhanas that they suggest, even as early as the Siddha Yogeshwari Martha, the earliest of the Trika text, may be written about the 4th century, probably not later than the 5th, is complaining in the beginning about endless sadhanas given by, gurus that just don't do anything. And it seems to me that basically that is, a valid complaint throughout the entire system. And while there is, a tantric tradition, it has nothing to do with the things that have been written down about it, or very little to do with the things that have been written down about it.
What about our Lalita practices? They come from all of that?
Our Lalita practices come from me. There is a valid ancient tradition that has been thought about, but mostly misunderstood and elaborated by Brahmins whose tendency is to make a ritual more and more and more and more demanding for no good reason.
And what did Professor Sanderson think of this theory?
Well, I think Sanderson is fine with it. I think Alexis has come to the point where he even says outright that he's not sure, that Abhinavagupta had much contact with any, real tantric tradition. And he's saying that, he seems to be ducking questions and avoiding commentary on important issues to the degree that he's not sure he even knows what they mean. He doesn't know what they mean, which is why he avoids commentary. And he has a whole aesthetic sensibility that is quite learned and refined, and he is very extraordinary in his articulation of it. There are some good parts about Abhinavagupta too. He's not all bad. The good parts being Abhinavagupta has articulated in the 10th century the most sophisticated understanding of any, religious, of human religious experience that anybody has done so far. If you excerpt it from, what he's done is taken his understanding out of a specific religious context, said, whatever your religious context, you know, doesn't matter, follow your, whatever your conviction and your intuition is. And then he lays out this vision of, you know, a completely unified and interdependent reality, you know, unified reality in which all forms are totally and completely interdependent and grounded in and given meaning by, you know, resonance.
Abhinavagupta.
Yes.
So there's a validity in that.
Yeah, there's definitely. I mean, it's not that, I'm not saying that everything is invalid. I mean, much of especially Abhinavagupta's vision is, I think, really quite learned and remarkable. But when you start to get down to it in the text, you know, the understanding of these practices and the way they're structured is so hamstrung by the Shaiva's commitment to continuity and the non-dualist, you know, decision to try to continue to maintain themselves within a particular historical stream. You know, that they just completely, you know, are unable to define the terms in the way they want, their language in the way they might, and give it meaning in a simple way. You know, they've got to like compete with the dualists and everybody else and argue stuff which becomes, you know, it's like completely away from the point.
Is that inherent in putting spiritual practices in writing?
No. Why should it be?
I don't know, because I don't know any, if we're now potentially and at least somewhat discounting the validity of these texts, I feel like we've discounted validity of pretty much every other religious text. Is once things get put into writing and certain bodies of people deemed
Is it
master.
inevitable? Is it inevitable? Well, it may very well be inevitable. It seems to be a big trend in historical trend in humanity among human beings that, you know, once something has started to be codified, it generates an argument for maybe commercial purposes or some kind of political purpose, which ultimately ends up leading us completely astray from the whole circumstance. I mean, for instance, the whole discussion, which seemed to be big in the Malini Vijayottara, about states of consciousness, is stupid and useless. I mean, it's just useless. That whole list, however, you know, who gives a flying fuck? And what does it have to do with anything? And moreover, you know, there is no connection between normal human experience and any of those, all those varieties of states of consciousness, particularly in every stage, once you got past like waking and dreaming and waking, and sleeping and dreaming and sleeping, and, you know, and waking in deep sleep and waking in dreaming in deep sleep, or waking in dreaming.
I'm dizzy, stop it.
I mean, you know, once you get past the second category and each stage, you've gone beyond any kind of human experience. And if they're going to give that to us, then they have to build for us a bridge from the place, from stage 2 or stage 1 in each of those categories to the subtler states that they're speaking of, and they do not. And this raises the issue, do they even know what the hell they're talking about? And why is this important anyway?
So why do we do the practices then?
No. You have missed my point. Practices that we're doing have been transmitted to us from Nityananda through Rudy and Muktananda, and reaffirmed by over and over again by various practitioners that I've met over the years and had some, you know, relationship with. And the practices, at least the practices that I share with you, are practices which are in fact, you know, talked about both, let's say, by Abhinavagupta, but especially by Shemaraj and his commentaries on the Netara Tantra, the Svachanda Bhairava Tantra, and even the Pratyabhijna Hridayam, which is an original text by him. These practices are talked about. And I think Shemaraj is by now, I think, this is without having gone through the entire Tantra Loka, which Sanderson will do. Right now, I would say Shemaraj demonstrates the biggest commitment among all the later Shaivas meaning after the 9th century, to the practice of yoga and its relationship to agama, which we translate as revelation. But you can also translate it as intuition, because a revelation is definitely intuitive.
So Shemaraj was around the 9th century?
Mm-hmm. No, Shemaraj is definitely late 10th century.
And you're saying as a practitioner of the lineage that we're practicing in, the validity comes in the experiences he had and the way it was transmitted, and that's what makes it...
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the validity comes, first of all, from our own experience. You know, an experience that was shared with us in a very human way by Rudy and Muktananda, who shared it, who had it shared with them by Nityananda. And, you know, if you look, Nityananda's teachings are relatively simple and mostly incoherent, translated in an incoherent way in any case.
And not necessarily sourced to these texts.
And definitely not sourced to these texts. Nityananda made no attempt to... I mean, first of all, his audience was mostly poor and unlearned at all. Illiterate was mostly his audience. And, you know, any literate people that he didn't interact with scholars at all. Scholars were by then already thinking they're beyond him. He's just a useless, you know, dirty sadhu. And so there's a whole bunch of what do I want to say, stratification in Indian culture that tends to deny any real practitioner, you know, access to, or deny any real student of any of this, you know, they're denied access to each other by the propaganda that exists in sort of the stratification of Indian society. You know, you won't find many Brahmins going to somebody like Nityananda who then, you know, and if you meet somebody as powerful as Nityananda, suddenly all this intellectual any attempt to explain it is just out of your head. You're in bliss. What do you need to talk about it for? Part of what Rudy shared with me had the tag Tantric teachings next to it.
Mm-hmm.
And the two elements of Rudy's Tantric teaching are about power and about liberation. And so, I have this experience with Rudy, and I'm holding that experience and trying, you know, thinking maybe I'll never figure this out, because it was only like 6 or 7 months was how long Rudy was working on it with me. Maybe a little more, but even so, that's no time at all. And then, you know, I'm with Muktananda, and Muktananda tells me, read Shaivism. So I do. I start looking at the most god-awful translation of the Pratyabhijna Hridayam done by Amma and Tejo Mayananda in the Siddha Yoga context, and it's terrible, horrible. But I keep banging away at it. Shortly thereafter, I think Jaidev Singh came out with his series of books from Swami Lakshmanju, and then I met Swami Lakshmanju. And so I'm working on this and reading Shaivism, going along, and, you know, and at each juncture in this whole process of reading Shaivism and unwrapping these textual traditions, you know, you come to a place where, it seems like, apart from the very simple practices that are called anavopaya, there's nothing there.
Bells and whistles? Is that kind of what?
What I think it is I think that, first of all, what you have is a group of Brahmins who are taking the emphasis of these teachings away from spiritual practice and putting it much more into an aesthetic, and religious context, which I think is aimed at reaching more people. Well, and maybe the thought is that if they reach more people, then eventually some of these people will practice, and possibly that's true. I think the Pratyabhijna is a very interesting and learned book. I think that the Shiva Sutras is a very interesting and learned book, a little more impenetrable, an effort to reach, to sort of reach some kind of understanding about the common dimensions of the Kashmirian non-dualist traditions, and there were probably many by then. And so they're interesting and they can be meaningful, and the practices, they actually talk about practices which can be helpful. But the practices themselves, for the most part, are anavopaya, and anavopaya is expressed in a way that makes it seem like anavopaya is like a low order of activity, which you have to ultimately move away from in order to get anywhere. And this isn't exactly the way it is. It is almost exactly the opposite, where the anavopaya activities lead to a refinement which then you can think of as Shaktopaya, Shambhavopaya, but this refinement, as it is expressed in these texts, suggests that we have gone from a physical activity or an effort to a state of awareness which is more mental. And that state of awareness that I think anavopaya is attempting to suggest, and which the practices suggest, is more subtle and refined than any kind of thinking or mental activity. And in fact, moving from a rational to a trans-rational experience, and the upayas are a kind of an attempt to suggest a rational approach to a trans-rational experience. That trans-rational experience, basically is, by definition, without internal structure. It is without internal structure that can accumulate, data points and build, models, build contexts for information and facts. That is how people live their lives.
It doesn't have that structure.
Doesn't, the ultimate experience transcends structure and information.
And yet to impart that information, we put this structure on.
Well, I think
it.
People who don't really understand it, forget that they haven't really noticed that that structure has to be gone if we're really getting to the experience that we are hoping for. An ultimate reality that transcends, time and space can't have within it some kind of temporal spatial structure that around which, any kind of cultural context can be organized in our mind.
I guess that's my point of, once something is put in writing and set as a way, it's lost the way. because just by the very nature of putting it into text gives it a structure that doesn't exist in the...
I think it's possible to write things down simply and straightforwardly. I think that these people were, you know, basically, most of these texts look like they were accumulated over some period of time and probably manipulated by people who were trying to impress us with how smart they are.
So you're going to keep digging into them and studying them?
Well, yeah, sure. I'm going to, for sure. And,
Because
you know,
there are gems and jewels within them that you can pull from.
well, I think basically Abhinavagupta's Tantraloka is a worthy, I mean, Alexis, who's translating it, says it is the most elegantly written work in Sanskrit. And he would know. And, you know, his passion for translating it is for that reason, because it's extraordinary. But you still wonder, you know, how much did Abhinavagupta really have? We'll never answer that question, and of course we can ask that question about lots of people. The one thing I can say for sure is Rudy was fucking amazing. And Muktananda was totally amazing, an extraordinary, powerful person. Nityananda exceeded them both by orders of magnitude. We're blessed for that. And we have an experience which is true and real and sustained us and has actually done something. It's created a community which continues to impress people. So that's powerful and undeniable. And I think, you know, the basis of this, like from the inside, the deep inside, all the way through to the expression of a place in the world among and for human beings for their benefit, you know, is possible to describe. So that entire experience, from its simplest inner core to its most sophisticated external expression, can be described.
And do you feel it has been described, and in what text?
I don't think it's been described yet, but it
Really?
might be in my text. Well, for instance, you know, we start out with the basis of Kaula Yoga. And Kaula, according to the Malini Vijaya, is people who stay in the world, who have worldly lives in a worldly context, and who do practices, you know, on their own and live in the world and among people and still achieve something extraordinary. And then we kind of fit in that category. We don't live outside the world, and, you know, we're not, you know, we're omnivorous. We, you know, we are much more aesthetically inclined than we are ascetically inclined. And, you know, we have a rich cultural, artistic, emotional, intellectual, you know, lives, as well as spiritual lives, and rich family lives in some cases. I guess in all of our cases. Because those of us who don't have children have rich lives together. So there is a lot that we can say that ties us to Kaula, and one of there are two central inner parts that tie us to the Kaulas, and that is the discussion of Kundalini and the discussion of Shaktipat. And it's clear that in the Malini Vijayottara, Abhinavagupta's source text for the Tantraloka, and the reason why we wanted to know more about this text, because it's Abhinavagupta's source text. And we're hoping to know more about it for the purpose of being better informed about Alexis's Tantraloka lectures. But the fact is, they have no idea about Kundalini in that text. There's no definition of Kundalini given, just the term. And maybe it's because the term has previously and for centuries been already so defined they feel there's no need to discuss it. That's possible. But we go on from there to the Kaula, the structure of Kaula Yoga, which is Pinda, Pada, Rupa, and Rupatita, and there's no discussion of what that means either, really.
Well, I was just talking to someone about this the other day, the passion with which people like Professor Sanderson stay in the scholastic realm, and that seems to be what most people want, is you're either a scholar or a practitioner.
You know, there are Buddhist practitioners who are scholars who are well accepted, and Christian ministers and priests who are scholars of Christianity and well accepted. And it's only in the area of Tantric Shaivism that there seems to be this big
Yeah, I don't understand
taboo.
it, because I have to say, how else do we find validity in anything if you aren't willing to be very scholastic and also do the practices, so you have the experiential knowledge that can only come from practicing that which you study?
Well, one of the things is, I mean, this is true of all those traditions as well, but, you know, one of the things is that there are not very many people who actually understand Kundalini or Shaktipat. They're two of the core parts of our own experience, and so, you know, maybe that's part of the problem, but if you don't, and the amount of time it would take to sort out just those two really just fundamentally essential terms for most scholars would deny them the possibility of understanding anything else. Most of the texts, which might be interesting, have not really been studied because they're too difficult. And what was actually being said, you know, the language is technical, and what was actually being talked about, you know, may never be understood.
From a practitioner standpoint or a scholastic standpoint?
Well, because you're dealing with language, and you're dealing with language which was copied and recopied over time.
Thousands.
So it's a problem. But, you know, you have the same problem also, for instance, in Chinese medicine, where, you know, a lot of times really gifted practitioners understood that power is knowledge. This is definitely true in Ayurveda. Ayurvedic practitioners who are really smart and accomplished don't teach other people. They have their gig, which is special, which they work to the extreme, and maybe they teach their kid if they like their kid, maybe they don't. You know, the human politics means that we've learned stuff that we've forgotten so many times it's unbelievable. And in the Chinese medical texts as well, you have you know, lots of things that are written down in the ancient literature that are written down completely inadequately because people don't want to know. So, and I think, you know, we have in the business world in America things that have been learned, you know, in the tech world. There are things that have been learned and forgotten and learned and forgotten and learned and sort of excluded because it wasn't the financially most efficient way to get someplace.
Wow, that's a lot. But the thing I'm taking away right now is that I always tend to question everything. I think that's in your nature too, but you're getting deeper into your scholastic endeavors into these texts over the last decades while being a practitioner. That makes you rare already historically. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, literally from your lineage of practitioners, they were not scholastic. Then your connections to the preeminent scholars in this field weren't practitioners. And you've now got 45 years of blending those two things. And historically, for thousands of years, I think it's the same thing. People were practitioners or scholars, and there was a caste system, and so the scholars were removed from the practices. And you're starting to tease out things that for social and political reasons and then academic integrity reasons haven't been teased out in thousands of years.
Yeah, it's possible. You know, and the reason to think about it now is because we also have people teaching this material who are semi-scholars. Maybe, you know, now there's a bunch of people who are comparative religionists in the United States who are actually making a really big amount of money teaching Kashmir Shaivism. When in fact, as time passes, it becomes increasingly apparent that the Kashmir Shaivism that they're teaching is totally made up by them and has nothing to do with the real, the real tradition that the Kashmirian writers were speaking to.
Mhm.
So that's kind of fascinating. And, we have, works, there are numerous books out by contemporary authors who, people are spending a lot of money to learn with, and who clearly don't know anything, which is kind of a drag here.
This was super amazing and fascinating. I'll just close by saying we have really unique opportunities here, both with practitioners and scholars in this field. So these kind of discussions go on all the time, but I'm glad that Swamiji brought this up today to share with you guys. I hope you got some great stuff out of it. Come here and study.